hop in. If you're tuning in today, today is day 3. We're super excited to dive in. And if you've been with us for the past 3 days, you know that we are recording the session today, and we're going to make it available to you tomorrow so that you'll be able to watch it again. If you have questions that you would like us to answer, we may not get to all of them. We are very much going to try, but please put your questions in the Q&A function. You can see it at the bottom of your screen. And when our presenters have finished today, we'll get through as many of your questions as we can. The posting will be, when we record the session today, the video will be sent to you tomorrow in your email, or you can find it on the distance learning page along with lots of other great stuff. If you missed earlier in the week, all of those recordings are live and posted, and we have one more tomorrow on indoor gardening, led by Christian, who some of you have seen his workshops with us before. So that's also going to be a lot of fun. And so without further, I'm going to turn it over to the teaching garden. If you have ever been to the teaching garden on Governor's Island, you know it's a beautiful site. Think rows of kale growing with the city skyline in the background. And normally in a regular year, they host tons of school trips. But this year, because that wasn't possible, they switched to production, and we'll let you learn from them directly just how they did that and just how much they were able to produce and donate to our New York City community. So I'm going to turn it over to Eve, Chloe, Sean, and Susanna from the Teaching Garden.
Great. So I'm Sean. I'm the program manager for Grow NYC's Teaching Garden on Governor's Island.
Hi, everyone. I'm Eve. I am the education coordinator for the Teaching Garden.
I'm Chloe. I'm the farm coordinator at the Teaching Garden.
And I'm Susanna, and I work with the Teaching Garden just a few days a week. And I also work with 2 residential rooftop farms. Last season, I worked with a much smaller garden in Brooklyn that I'm going to be sharing some perspectives on today.
Great. So we are so excited to share a little bit about our journey from going from an educational garden to one that was really oriented towards production. So in this workshop, we're going to try to cover 4 topics, which we think are kind of essential to being a production-oriented garden. The first one is choosing crops to grow. As you'll find out, when you're focused on production as opposed to education, there's a whole different set of thinking that goes into choosing what to grow. The second, and this is probably the thing that folks are most interested in, is just how to maximize the yield. So we'll definitely get into that. And another very important piece is sort of mobilizing and engaging your community. It doesn't do any good if you grow that food and don't have anyone to give it to. And then the last one is choosing a compatible donation partner. So just very quickly, just a little bit about the Teaching Garden. I think whenever we talk about anything these days, where we sort of have to talk about like pre-pandemic and then post or current pandemic. So pre-pandemic, the Teaching Garden was a 1-acre space on Governor's Island. We had been, for the last 8 or so years, we had been bringing groups of public school students out to visit the space. And the focus of our programming there was really just to get young people out of their neighborhoods, out of the city, and just really engage with nature and with the processes that go into growing food. Our programming was free, and we really tried to prioritize students who were in neighborhoods where they wouldn't otherwise have access to this kind of programming, who wouldn't maybe have access to green space. And so that was in a nutshell kind of what we were trying to do. Over the last 8 years, the space expanded. We started off about 7,000 square feet, and we grew and grew each season till we were just over 1 acre. Most of the space was dedicated to vegetable production, but we have some fruit there. And in the last couple seasons, we started growing flowers as well. And before the pandemic, we were really focused on education. But what produce we did grow, the students would get a chance to harvest and eat, cook it and eat it as part of their field trip. And then if we had extra produce, which we often did, we would donate that to different organizations around the city. But that was sort of an afterthought. You know, the focus was really on the food for students.
All right, so then March of 2020 happened, and the pandemic became a challenge for us. So our kind of big question was, how does our space stay relevant? What are we even going to do when there are no field trips, there are no students coming through, and we don't have corporate volunteers to help us maintain the space? So you can go to the next slide. So we went from working with about 5,000 students a season to small groups of students. We invited kind of caregivers and 10 kids at a time, ideally groups that learn together, but sometimes it would be a mom and her 2 kids, and we were kind of just happy to get anybody into the space to do education. But mostly what we did 2020 and what we're currently doing is grew food for production. So as Sean was saying, when students came before the pandemic, they would all get to pick something. We grew a lot of carrots, we grew a lot of cherry tomatoes, things that all the kids can just pick one of. So we transitioned the types of things we grew from, colorful carrots and tons of carrots so that everyone who comes through can pick one carrot, to things like potatoes, which are heavy producers and a staple for folks to eat. And Chloe's going to talk more about our changes to the crop plan later. We also increased our growing space. So we had garden rows that were about 3 feet and paths that were about 3 feet. And we have just extended our rows to be 4 feet, and we've shortened our paths to be 2 feet. So we've gotten more space in our rows, but we also, used what we had. So random wheelbarrows that were broken became planters. Trash cans that we weren't using became planters. Small paint buckets became planters. Basically anything we could, and we had some success and some failure. The wheelbarrows, we realized, didn't have enough drainage. So the things that worked best for us were things that we could drill a hole into the bottom, but really just growing anywhere we could grow. And we went from a staff of 5 or 6 folks to 2 or 3. And we had a lot of help from corporate volunteers before the pandemic. So we kind of all worked really hard, and it was, a lot of us were just educators, and now we're farm hands. So we learned a lot last year about like growing and how to grow. So I think there's one more slide here. So yeah, what do we grow? I said this a little before, carrots. We grew a lot of carrots pre-pandemic. We would grow purple, orange, white carrots to show kids there are different colors of carrots. We grew a lot of food that kids could eat raw. So tomatoes to make salsa, basil to make pesto. And we transitioned from that kind of produce to staple produce that can be like nutritious for people. So a lot more kale, a lot more collards, a lot more Swiss chard, lettuce. We still grew tomatoes, carrots, peppers, beets. Basically anything you can find at a Grow NYC farmer's market, we are growing in the teaching garden. Herbs as well. And a lot of times, we'll talk about who we partnered with later, but a lot of times those pantry programs get a lot of canned foods and they lack kind of fresh, nutritious vegetables. So we were really happy to be able to provide that to the groups we donated to. When do we grow? So we did, when you're growing for production, you need to transition more of your things in and out quicker. So more successions, utilizing low tunnels, which can keep things warmer in a row, utilizing our greenhouse and our hoop house, kind of recognizing the end of the plant's life. So when we grew for education, sometimes we would let a collard or a broccoli go to flower and to seed to show kids, this is what it looks like, this is what happens. And when we switched to production, those got nixed out of the garden as soon as they were not producing. Our eggplants were still producing, but really slowly, and we cut them all down to make room for new things. So it's kind of like recognizing when is that plant slowing down, and can I get something else in that bed that is going to produce more in the rest of the season? Also, putting a bunch of stuff together in a bed. So right now in our garden, we have peppers growing with lettuce and herbs on the side. So those lettuce are going to come out in the next week or two, and that the peppers are still small enough that they have enough room to grow together with the lettuce. So recognizing, root size and what can you squeeze in here, then still keep the plants healthy. And where do we grow? I talked a little bit about this. We had a lot more raised beds on the border of our garden that we used, and kind of just using random planters. I see a lot of people growing with like a milk gallon that they cut the top off of. So you can really grow in anything if you have space for it.
All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about more generally about some tools that you all can use in your spaces. And this is sort of adapting all the things that Eve talked about to different spaces, whether it's a smaller space or a rooftop or anything like that. So the first tool we're going to talk about, on the next slide, please, is choosing what crops we grow. So Eve spoke a little bit about what the teaching garden did, but more generally, what we wanted to consider and what you should consider if you want to grow for donation is who your community is that you'd like to donate to. So we want to choose varieties that are familiar to people, that if you're offering it, they'll be happy to receive, they'll know how to cook it, and they'll know how to keep it in their homes. So the second thing is shelf life and storage. Do you have a refrigerator? Is it something that will be okay if you just keep it in the shed or under the shade of a tree for the day until people pick it up? How long will it last in people's homes before it goes bad? And that goes along with like how much of something you want to grow. If you give every person that you're donating to a pound of basil, what are they going to do with it? Will they be able to process it? Is it just going to all go bad in their fridge? The next thing to consider when choosing crops is transportation. A really good example of this in this photo here is our strawberries that you can see. This is how we packed them to go in the back of the van to get dropped with one of our donation partners. And this was sort of a challenge that we figured out as we went, but if you plan for it, even better. So these strawberries are actually in old seedling trays, those plastic trays that you can get seedlings in. So it's a challenge where if you're going to donate something like strawberries or cherry tomatoes, these can't really be stacked and you might need a larger vehicle. So to consider things like that, how much space does it take up? What will you transport it in safely? We also want to consider what's culturally appropriate. So what people are eating in the neighborhood or the community that you're donating to, or like you can look around and see what's being sold, what's popular. Again, we want to make sure that once you hand off the produce to your community, it's something that they're excited to get and they know how to use for their homes. And lastly, and maybe most importantly, what's available to you? Do you have a budget? Are you going to be able to buy seeds, like any seeds that you'd like? Are you going to be able to buy plant starts, which is a little more expensive? Or can you source them another way? Personally, for my little backyard garden, I've had really good luck on a local buy nothing group. So there's ways for a small space to get things even without a budget. But when you start to have a larger space, you need to consider, are you going to save seeds? Can you afford plant starts? All of these things. And then another great tool is succession planting. So Eve mentioned kind of pulling out a plant when it starts to slow down production, and that's related to this. So succession planting it's a planting method. And the idea is that you plant the same crop multiple times throughout the season so that you can continuously harvest that crop. So on this image here, you can see where there's white. That's where the harvest is for each crop. So you can see that they overlap, and that's the idea, is that as the first crop that you planted slows down, the next one is getting ready to start up, and you can continue to harvest. So this is based usually on a couple of things, on how long it takes the plant to mature to harvest, and also the weather. So you can see here some things, you're only going to do 6 sessions of in the spring and the fall, and some things you're only going to do 6 sessions of in the summer because they like it warmer. And that's fine. You can still do 6 sessions of them. If you just plant them a couple of weeks apart, you'll extend your harvest a little bit. So for example, at the teaching garden last year, we aimed to plant bush beans, string beans, about every 3 weeks. And we found that that gave us a good time frame where when that first crop is starting to slow down, we can go ahead and cut those out, and we feel okay because the next crop is starting to produce, so we still have those green beans. So that's really easy to do with direct seeded crops, and that's something we do really often. And since we're in the growing season already, if you didn't plan for this, that's okay. You can still do this with things that are a little less sensitive to temperature. So we tend to do a lot of this with like bush beans, lettuces, even carrots if you get a heat tolerant carrot. And these are things that if you pull something out of your garden, something stops producing, a crop fails, you can throw those seeds in and start your succession crop right now. It doesn't have to be planned for really fancy like this chart, especially in a smaller space, as long as you have some extra seeds or can go and buy seedlings.
Okay, so Eve sort of touched on this a few minutes ago, but we're gonna talk a little bit more about companion planting and interplanting. And it's really all about making the most of your growing space to maximize your harvest. And I think this is really easy for growers in New York City to understand, especially because every square inch of your apartment counts, your life counts. So it's true as well in the garden, where you really want to make the most use of the space that you have, like down to the square inch if you can. So companion planting is sort of an offshoot of interplanting. And interplanting matches up plants based on their light requirements, their root systems, their nutrient needs, and the speed at which they grow. While companion planting pairs up crops that improve each other's growth patterns and their ability to fight off pests and disease. So together, these two concepts really help to make the most out of the space that you have available, to reduce weed pressure and increase your yields. And I've heard this kind of referred to as like 3D gardening, where you're not just thinking of what space you have on either side laterally, but you're thinking kind of like above the plant that you're growing, below the plant that you're growing. So you're thinking in all directions as you're planting. So in this photo, you can see there's a mix of tomatoes, lettuce, basil, and some marigolds. And we planted the lettuce before we planted the tomatoes, knowing that the lettuce would mature before the tomatoes got too big and shaded out the lettuce. So that's interplanting. And then we added basil and marigolds to help improve the flavor of the tomato and to repel pests. So that's companion planting. And this is a great way to think about making the most of your space, where you're using the space that's below taller crops as a way to interplant faster growing crops. So a good pairing is like radishes and tomatoes. Radishes mature in about 20 days or so. Tomatoes take much longer, so that's a good option. Or growing carrots below peppers because they have different growth habits. So you're taking advantage of different root systems that kind of use different space within the soil. And then using herbs all over the place is a great way to boost your harvests, especially around crops that will be in the garden until the end of the season, and you want to use the space around them before they mature. So in the teaching garden, as Eve said, yeah, we planted cilantro with eggplant, we did dill with peppers, we do basil with tomatoes. So herbs are a really easy way to grow more food, and you can be really hands-off about it. They're often very low maintenance, and they bring a lot of joy to people because they're so aromatic and fun to use. And one more thing on kind of making the most of your space is to harvest in a way that encourages the plants to keep growing, that will leave the crops that you have that are producing well in the garden for longer. So for leafy greens and some herbs like parsley and cilantro, harvesting from the outside in will kind of tell the plant to keep growing and keep maturing. Or you could give plants like arugula, we just did this the other day, kind of like a tall haircut where you grow or where you cut the plant kind of right above the center or the growing tip, so that that part of the plant stays intact. And this is called cut and come again. And there's so much to say on all of these topics, but I would encourage you just to do some Googling on companion planting, interplanting, cut and come again, just to kind of get a sense of all of the different sorts of examples that are out there that you can hopefully use to your advantage. Next slide, please. So let's say that you've kind of maximized your designated growing space that's maybe in the center of your garden, and you're realizing that you might want to increase your growing space. So you can do this by adding beds around the border of your garden that maybe you haven't considered before. So these can look really great along a fence and invite the community to come and ask what's growing and how they can get involved. I think at the teaching garden we have something like 20 to 30 border beds that were added that are incredibly productive. We're growing potatoes there this year, which is really a high yield storage crop. So really think about all of the space that you have and add that growing space where you can in a spot that's kind of eye-catching for people. Or you can think about all sorts of DIY options. So again, yeah, we tried to transition some wheelbarrows into planters, didn't have enough drainage, but you could use milk crates that are lined with special grow bag fabric. You might have seen a lot of those as like a big initiative last spring. You could use broken 5-gallon buckets, or you could even like go out and get new or upcycled 5-gallon buckets. You could grow in watering cans, takeout containers, like large food cans with any sharp edges that have been filed down. I've seen people growing in boots. I mean, like any kind of vessel that you have can really hold some soil and hopefully hold some plants. But whatever you're growing in, you want to make sure that it has drainage holes, whether they're there already or if you need to add them in yourself, just with a drill. And if you're growing in materials that are not food grade, like tires, sometimes you'll see those where they're kind of cut to look like a flower, which is really nice looking. You just want to line them with landscape fabric so that for safety. You could also grow in fabric grow bags. Those are really great. They fold flat, so if you know that you maybe won't need them always, they store very easily. They could also be machine washed, which is awesome. If you have a pest or disease problem, you can just throw that container in the wash and sanitize it. And you can also move them around very easily. You could also grow in bags of soil that you get from the garden center and just cut out a hole in the center of it and throw some plants in. Straw bales are really great. We're not doing that at the teaching garden, and straw bales are hard to find in the city at least, but if you can find them, they're great. And then you can also think vertically if you're out of horizontal space. So you could make hanging planters yourself out of gallon water bottles or pallets or even PVC pipes. There are lots and lots of ideas. Again, the internet is your friend here. Pinterest is your friend if you're into that. So definitely get creative. And next slide, please. So if you're producing more food, that means that's great, but then that also means that there's more work to do in the garden. So you'll want to think about how you can mobilize your community to help out, whether they're students or parents, family members, your roommates, whoever. And volunteers usually, if they're coming out of their own volition, right, they tend to come with a lot of energy and they're thrilled to harvest and process your produce. especially for more intricate harvests like herbs or cherry tomatoes, which is great because sometimes if you're growing a lot of food, you get kind of tired of doing those little smaller things. And this type of work can also be really therapeutic for volunteers. So it's something that your support system can kind of get lost in and feel the benefits of helping out. But also consider that sometimes having volunteers can be more work than you expected because there's extra training and supervision that needs to happen. So just kind of think about that in terms of your space, and know that just because you're working with volunteers, you're getting kind of free labor doesn't mean that you don't get to kind of set up a system that matches your needs and really makes the most sense for your site. So you'll want to figure out if you want just one volunteer who you can train with and work with really closely, or maybe it would be helpful to have a big group. And maybe the answer to that depends on, excuse me, the day of the week or the time of the season. Maybe it's easy for you to have people just come and drop in, or maybe you want to know who's coming in advance and you would like for them to register and maybe provide some more information on their skills and things like that. And remember that all ages can pitch in if it's safe for them to do so at your site. This is definitely true of smaller crops like berries or ground cherries. Those are great for small hands and a lot of fun. And be sure to use signage and other marketing tactics as you can. At the McCarran Park demonstration garden, we had just 3 like laminated signs that we printed out and just zip tied to the fence that was facing the street to advertise what we were doing here, where the produce was going, and volunteer drop-in hours. And that was an incredible way to just bring people in and get them involved and excited. So signs are great. They don't have to be fancy. You could hand paint them if you want. You could also use social media, local newsletters that you know about, or newspapers. You could even hang up flyers in your neighborhood. So definitely get the word out if you decide that you are ready for volunteer help.
All right, so we're going to chat a little bit about donating your harvest. And I think, like, before jumping into this, I have a garden confession that relates to this. So before joining the Teaching Garden, before joining Grow NYC, I was pretty skeptical of the idea that urban agriculture could really produce like enough food, or food in a meaningful way. I'd come from a background where I was doing agriculture in a rural setting. I was running a farm. We went to farmers markets. We had CSAs, and that just seemed like that was the way to get food to people. And for the from its start, I always thought the Teaching Garden was a great place, and community gardens across the city were great places for New Yorkers to learn about food. But when it came time to actually buy that food, I always thought the farms in our green market network, the farmers market network, the rural farms around New York City were a much better source for providing food. But then the pandemic hit, and as I'm sure we all remember, like within the course of a couple of days, supermarket shelves were, out of essentials, including lots of produce. And we were standing in our 1 acre in Governor's Island with tons of produce ready to give out. And I think over the course of the last year and into this year, I realized just how wrong I am about the fact that urban agriculture can and should be an important part of the food system that we have in the city. And so as growers and everyone here who's growing or interested in growing, a key part of that is also finding partners to get the food distributed. And I think there's a couple different ways you can go about doing that. One is to partner with an existing community organization that's already distributing food. So it could be a community center, it could be a faith-based organization. Lots of different nonprofits are out there trying to address food insecurity. And in many cases, those organizations are receiving big pallets of canned food and things like that. but are not necessarily receiving a lot of fresh produce. So as growers, as gardeners and urban farmers, what we can offer in the form of fresh produce is often something that those organizations are not getting a lot of. Another way you can kind of get your produce out there is by having the community come to you. So a lot of gardens will do this. They'll have open hours, or they'll set up a table outside the garden that has extra produce, and people know to come by and pick it up if they need it. So building community around your space and having those that you're trying to serve come into your space and help cultivate the produce, or just come and pick it up is another way you can get it out to folks. And then another one, and is a really, I think a more recent a more recent like invention, I guess, that's gotten a lot of press in the last year or so, is this network of community fridges. And if this is something you're not familiar with, it's definitely worth looking up. But basically, it's fridges, refrigerators around the city where people put extra food, they put produce, whatever it is, and then those who need it can stop by and just pick it up, and it's totally free. And there's a website, we can put this in the chat later, that has a map of all the community fridges in the city, and it's really it's an incredible and like very beautiful grassroots thing that grew quite a bit during the pandemic. All right, next slide. So with the Teaching Garden, we partnered with 3 organizations last season. We tried to choose nonprofits that reach the communities that we usually aim to work with our school programming. As we mentioned before, our school programming was mostly put on hold last year because of the pandemic. But we felt it was really important to try as best we could to kind of still reach those communities. So the first organization we partnered with is an organization called the Black Feminist Project. And they really work to enrich the lives of and restore agency and justice and joy and health to Black women and the children that those women care for. And they have a number of different programs that sort of have an emphasis on mother-led families, including a community food program where they distribute food boxes or sort of grocery bags with a week's worth of essentials. And we provided produce for that food, for the community food program. It was a wonderful partnership. They work in the South Bronx. They would come down and meet us at the ferry with a minivan. We would just pack it up with as much produce as we could, and then they would take it from there, bring it back up to their sort of community center, pack up the bags, and get them out to the community. So from our end, it made a lot of sense. We had to harvest the produce and then just give it to them, and then they took care of really getting it out to the people that needed it. So that's, I think, an ideal partnership because they came to us and then did the rest of the work. The second organization we partnered with is an organization called Chili's on Wheels. So they provide vegan food relief with plant-based hot meals and groceries to people, individuals, families that are food insecure. We provided produce for basically the similar thing as what we were doing with the Black Feminist Project. It's sort of a bag or a box of food that was distributed in Brownsville and also in Mott Haven. And for part of the year, for much of the year last year, they would actually set up, I think in Brownsville in particular, they would set up outside of public schools, and they were offering fresh produce as a supplement to the free meals that the public schools were handing out. Unfortunately, many of the meals the public schools were handing out, there was a lot of processed food. There wasn't a lot of fresh produce. So this was a way to sort of supplement that so that families could eat more nutrient-dense foods. And then the final organization we partnered with was an organization called Bloom Again Brooklyn. So they're another community-based nonprofit organization. And what they do is they repurpose unsold and what they call once used flowers. They repurpose them into new arrangements, which are then distributed by a network of volunteers to homebound seniors, to local nursing home residents, to trauma and homeless survivors, and to others in need. And they would come to the teaching garden with usually about a dozen or so volunteers. And they would actually just come and go through our cut flower garden, and they would cut flowers there. They'd make them into arrangements, and then they would drive them off the island and distribute them. So that was another great partnership for us because we grew the flowers, and then this organization came in and did the heavy lifting around distributing the produce. All right, next slide. So, I mean, as you can sort of see, I think distribution, figuring out like how to get the food out of your garden and to those in need requires some logistical challenges. So as you're looking for community groups to partner with, if you end up going that route, or if you're just thinking about trying to get that food directly to people in need, you know, there's a couple things you do want to think through. If it's a partnership with a community group, you're going to want to think about whether they can come pick up the produce. We found that we had limited capacity when it came to delivering produce. We could grow all the food anyone needed, but we didn't have regular access to a vehicle to get the food off the island. So it was really important that we found partners that could help us get the food off the island. You know, and if you do have a vehicle, can you just drop it right off at the organization? You know, what does the organization, what does the partner need from you other than growing the produce? And then, you know, we found in our search for partner organizations, we found that there's some organizations that have a minimum amount of produce that you can donate. So if you have a really small space, you have, you know, I don't know, you know, you're only growing in a couple milk crates. You know, it might make sense to find a few other gardeners in your neighborhood or in your community who are also growing, and maybe you can bundle your donation together. Another question that often comes up when you're looking for partners is how often can you donate? What we found is that we needed to donate at least once a week, just because of the pace at which our plants mature and fruit and are ready to be harvested during the summer. If we had to skip a donation with one of our partners, or for whatever reason we couldn't get the food to them for 1 week, then we would always need to find another outlet for that food. We really couldn't go more than a week or so with or a week maximum, just because we would end up with rotting food, and that's not what we wanted. You know, some organizations, they might not be able to handle a weekly donation. So maybe you try to work with 2 different organizations and you do a donation every other week to each of them. And then there might be organizations that really need a more regular donation. So, you know, that's a really good thing to figure out up front. And then a big one that we don't often think about as gardeners, because our tendency is just to harvest from the garden and go, you know, go inside and prepare it the day of or the day after, is that produce that's not going to be consumed in the garden or in your kitchen the day of often needs to be stored in some way to sort of slow down the decomposition process, right? So, so cold storage is important if you're going to be harvesting but not donating and distributing almost immediately. But there's some clever ways to do this. Obviously, if you have access to a refrigerator or other big cold storage space, great, wonderful. But if not, you know, at the teaching garden, we don't have that. So we would fill wheelbarrows up with cold water and submerge greens and other things like that that might wilt in the cold water overnight. And that kept them from wilting, that kept them, you know, in good shape. And that worked even on really, really hot days. You know, last summer we had a couple days that got close to 100 degrees. We had to harvest the day before the donation, but with the greens sitting in the water, they were totally fine. So thinking about storage is really important. And then Susanna, if you want to jump in a little bit and talk about what you guys did at McCarran also.
Yeah, so that garden is kind of right on the northern side of McCarran Park in Greenpoint, Williamsburg. The site has only 400 square feet of growing space, so it's significantly smaller, and we were looking for a partner who could take a weekly harvest because everything was still producing kind of, at that same quick rate, but we would really only have maybe like 50 to 75 pounds maximum. So we wound up working with this great organization called Los Sores, and they've been around for I think 30 or so years. They have their own pantry on site that's coupled with a senior center, and they were able to come by and pick up once a week. They would come with a van, and I would just load everything into kind of whatever vessels we had, whether those were old planting containers or IKEA bags, very helpful, very, very popular, or garbage bags, things like that, whatever worked. And they were really flexible, which was fantastic. But we only kind of found that group after striking out with another organization that was brand new. It was a pantry that started out of the pandemic, kind of as a response to COVID. And they were in the neighborhood, like within walking distance. So I thought, great, this is really helpful because, again, we didn't have access to a vehicle, so on foot was great. And the first harvest happened about this time last year, and I had 2 IKEA bags ready to donate. They asked me to dropped off, and I said, okay, and I schlepped the produce over, and then I couldn't get in touch with the partner at all for about an hour. I waited, called, emailed, texted, didn't hear back, and eventually just brought everything to my apartment because it was nearby and waited it out there. And I did hear back, and they were very apologetic, but they forgot about the donation. They had a lot going on. Again, they were like an organization that was a month old. And it was pretty annoying, frankly. So you want to make sure that whoever you partner with, whoever they are, wherever they are, that they can demonstrate to you that they're organized and that they're reliable. And this is especially true if you're working really hard to increase your production. You want to make sure that it has a really excellent home that is excited about what you're able to offer to them. So don't learn the hard way.
All right, next slide. All right, so just a quick plug here as we wrap up. Just a quick plug for the Teaching Garden. If you haven't been to our distance learning page before, highly, highly recommend you navigate over there. We do bi-weekly blog updates about the Teaching Garden. And then our other colleagues that are doing education at Grow NYC also create a lot of amazing content. You can find that at grownyc.org/virtual farm. Maybe we can put that in the chat as well. And then if you were interested, we would love to have you come visit the Teaching Garden with students in small groups. You can find the link on our Instagram, or you can email ebrown@grownyc.org. Maybe we can throw that in the chat as well. So that's like, that would be something we would definitely be interested in hearing from you about, because we've started opening up our educational programming. So we can't guarantee that we'll have a spot. We do have limited spots, and because of the pandemic, sort of some additional precautions that we're taking. But if you are interested, definitely reach out. And if you are not, you don't have a group of small people that you can bring for a field trip to the Teaching Garden, then you can just come out on any weekend between now and the end of October. You can just visit us on the from noon to 4, Saturdays and Sundays. We have activities for kids, and then we have other activities for adults as well. And but mostly you just kind of walk around the garden and kind of see what we're up to. So we hope to get to see you all in person at some point.
All right, so let's do questions. Quick reminder, if you have a question you'd like our panelists to answer, just put it in the Q&A, and I'm going to go in order from the top there. So earlier in the presentation, we referred to like wanting to grow more staples. So if you could just tell us like what are some examples of food staples?
So food staples is just referring to foods that can make up a big portion of our diet. So think potatoes, sweet potatoes, things that are nutritious, kale, collard greens, Swiss chard, stuff that people are familiar with, tomatoes, zucchini, basically everything, but not like specialized things like bitter melon, which we grew, but not a lot of people are familiar with it or know how to cook it. Rutabaga or kohlrabi are some unique ones that people like, but they're not necessarily staples.
Another question, we mentioned growing in PVC pipes earlier too, and someone is wondering about the safety of growing in PVC pipes. Is there any evidence that they are toxic to the food grown in them?
Not to my knowledge. If you're growing in like a plastic pot, that's really kind of the same system. It's just a different setup. So I don't believe there's any harm there, unless anyone knows otherwise.
Chloe, did you want to tag in on that?
I was just going to suggest in general, like we mentioned in the presentation, if something is not intended for growing in, better safe than sorry. You can always line it with something like landscape fabric. But yeah, like Susanna said, like hard plastics are a material that pots are made out of as well. So I wouldn't be too concerned about that, as opposed to something like tires, which are clearly not intended to ever have food in them, and maybe even already have something else that's bad for you in them that you would definitely want to line.
Right. There's a question in here that I'm going to take a stab at answering. It's about determining the weight capacity of a roof if you wanted to do a rooftop garden. So on that one, I would say if you're a school and you're considering this, and we've been getting a lot of inquiries about rooftop gardens this year, you can email us. There'll be an email on like the next slide, and we'll answer that question for you there. Okay, question for panelists again. Interplanting. Let's say you're planting a tomato next to lettuce. How far apart should they be? Go ahead, Eve.
So you want to make sure that whatever is growing together has enough room. So our lettuce we planted first, and those you generally give about a square foot of. So you put those a square foot apart, and then this picture shows it really nicely. And then the tomatoes, you want to make sure those have about 2 feet each. And it doesn't really matter if the lettuce are too close to the tomato or the tomatoes, because the lettuce you can see here, they're still little babies. So by the time, or the tomatoes are babies. So by the time the lettuce is big enough that we're going to harvest it, the tomatoes will have room to get bigger. So it's mostly just, everything can be super close together as long as the tomatoes at the end or the eggplant at the end will have enough room to grow. If that makes sense.
Okay, teaching garden. Do you till or do you use no-till practices in the garden? To till or not to till? That is the question. Go ahead, Sean.
That's a great question. So we cultivate the garden by hand is the sort of short answer to that. And we don't have a tiller. What we do instead is, we try to focus on minimally disturbing the soil throughout the year. So That doesn't mean that we don't sometimes have to stick a shovel or a rake into the ground, but we try and or plan out the season in such a way where, you know, we're not going in and turning the soil more than maybe one time during the year. So a lot of times that actually, we were just talking about companion planting, and a lot of times that what that looks like is, you know, we start by prepping the bed, putting some compost and whatnot in, and then planting the lettuce, and then next to that planting the tomatoes, and then the lettuce comes out and the tomatoes are already in the ground, and we really haven't had to do much to get the, you know, we haven't had to really disturb the garden. And then after that, maybe we're putting in peas or something like that. So we're sticking a shovel in maybe one time a year. So no-till, basically, asterisk.
And then we've got a couple of questions in here asking about companion planting. One person specifically wants to know about good companion crops for okra, and then some general questions. So maybe if there's a resource we can point them to that's good for companion planting ideas and ideas for okra.
I can take this one. Chloe, maybe you can add on. Okra is really tricky. I've found that in a lot of Googling, it's like not a crop that's referenced as something that is grown in a Northeast garden, which is frustrating. You can't go wrong with adding flowers like marigolds or cosmos or calendula. So that's a great idea, beautiful idea too. And there's a great resource online, I can add a link to it, from West Coast Seeds that has like this really comprehensive list of good companion crops, including herbs and flowers. So I'd recommend that, and I'll add a link now.
Yeah, I was gonna say something similar actually. Our okra this year is growing with flowers. It's growing with zinnias. And they're pretty, they're sort of similar sizes, so nothing's getting shaded out by anything else. And imagine, similar to the tomato or eggplant idea, you could put in an early spring crop. So okra right now is really tiny. It's gonna get really big, but while it's really small, it wouldn't hurt it to plant some lettuce or radishes around it. But I don't know of any other than flowers, like long season things that you would grow like under okra or anything like that. And as for resources for companion planting, this is my professional idea. If you do Google image search for a companion planting chart, there are all kinds of really great graphics if you're a visual person. That look all different ways. And if you find one that makes sense to you, there's like, you know, anything you can imagine, from like really pretty ones to very simple, straightforward ones. That'll just give you a general idea. And the majority of plants are okay with each other. And once you learn the few things that aren't, you can just kind of run with it.
And okay, so when you're making the plan at the teaching garden, is there like a website that you use for mapping, or like a resource that you use to help map out the garden, or something that might be helpful for people getting started?
We don't. I usually hand draw the garden on graph paper and treat it kind of like a puzzle, and try to fit in. I have a list of crops that I want to grow, and when they grow, and I try to fit it all together. If anybody else knows like a great website, please chime in.
Laura, you had your hand up first.
I was going to say we have crop planting calendars that we posted on the, I can add them to the follow-up resources for this workshop, but we already posted them as well on the website from Day One Garden Basics. And I love those calendars because it has what you can plant in the spring, what you can do for a fall harvest by planting in the summer. And then we also have a blank template, so you can take what you want from those and fill in your own template.
Yeah, there's a resource too that I thought I sent to everybody, but it just went to the panelists. It's the website growveg.com. Has a pretty handy tool. I think it's like $12 or $24 a year, and you can plug in little graphics of everything that you want to grow, so you can kind of see it visually instead of just listed. I started using that kind of my first year that I was making a crop plan. I thought it would be really helpful. But then I sort of found that it took too long to like select each icon and drag it into the space, that just like pen and paper was much faster and easier. But if you really want to be able to get a visual with like pictures or icons of what you want to grow, that can be a helpful tool.
And just not a question, just a comment. There was a lot of love for this chart and the chat and the Q&A. So we've done it. We've hit the end of the Q&A for today, which is amazing. Just as a reminder to everybody, we are going to send you all of these resources and the recording of today's workshop. It'll be in your inbox tomorrow, if you've signed up for tomorrow, when you get the reminder about indoor gardening basics tomorrow. Or you can
don't have to sign up. You're automatically signed up, so don't even worry about it. You're getting an email.
You are, yeah, whether you want one or not. So yes, but it'll have all the follow-up resources and that link to the distance learning page where you can find the recording and the resources mentioned today. I just want to say, what inspired this workshop was the fact that we had so many inquiries early on in the pandemic about people recognizing the need for food and the fact that they had gardens. And I think in all of the really challenging things that we experienced this year, watching the flood of inquiries about people just wanting to use their spaces to do good was a highlight for me and for us. And so thank you for being so generous and kind of pushing us to do this workshop, because it means you're trying to better serve your community. So if this is something that you're considering, you still have questions after today and you want to discuss your gardens a little further, you can email all of us at schoolgardens@grownyc.org, and we'll make sure that it lands with the right person. So thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you for the last day of the Beginner Gardener tomorrow on indoor gardening. So thanks, everybody.